Hello and welcome to the first Global Technopolitics Forums Roundtable in 2023. We will be discussing the 5G geopolitics and security, views from across the Atlantic. It's a timely, complex, and evolving concept and well aligned with the forum's mission of shaping the conversation at the intersection of technology and geopolitics. We will have 30 minutes of panel discussion moderated by Forum's Chairman Grigory Traverton, followed by 20 minutes of open floor for questions. But first, I would like to introduce the subject and set the scene. I encourage you to listen to the discussion, raise hand, or use chat to post your questions as we progress through this session. The slide, please. Next one. Next one. Thank you very much. 5G is the fifth generation standard for broadband cellular networks. Its key elements are mixed spectrum. Low band spectrum covers large geographical areas at lower speed, while high band spectrum offers speed capabilities but unable to travel long distance. The 5G architecture offers a mixed spectrum, enabling flexibility and adaptability. Massive MIMO, or multiple input, multiple output technology, is critical to a mixed spectrum environment and increases reliability. Network slicing is a configuration that allows multiple independent networks to be created on top of a common physical infrastructure, enabling it to handle a large number of simultaneous communication in a wide variety of industries. Visualization replaces hardware-based network function with software-based ones. And Open RAN is a network structure that opens the radio access network by allowing interoperability between RAN equipment from different vendors. Next slide, please. The outcome of low latency, high reliability, speed, and connected devices is massive and transformative. It reveals a system in which machines are integrated into critical infrastructure. Smart cars and smart cities, Internet of Things, and automated intelligence are just to name a few outcomes. To sum it up, if smartphones change our personal lives in ways we could not predict, 5G could change our societies and shape our future beyond our imagination. Next slide, please. 5G technology comes with many built-in security features. However, it will inherit some of the old security vulnerabilities and will present new challenges. Ironically, the same elements that make 5G an exceptional technology presents new security risks. For example, the shift to software inevitably expands the surface of cyber attacks. If the virtualization layer is breached, all network functions come under direct attack. The increasing use of open source software introduces the challenges of keeping a consistent and coherent approach to security by design and preventing deliberate security flaws. Due to the novelty and complexity of 5G, many countries will source 5G equipment and expertise. When 5G network infrastructure is collaboratively created by different operators, or when a single 5G network is shared by multiple mobile operators, attackers could target one of the low protection network slices, or attacks could be launched by potentially untrustworthy vendors. Since the network will be connected to many devices and critical systems, this creates a single point of failure. Finally, the multi-vendor environment is difficult to coordinate in terms of security policies and responsibilities. The 5G risks are alarming, considering that I have listed in the left side of the screen. Critical services have gone digital. Internet of Things are becoming a reality. Cyber hostility is on the rise and cyber attacks are increasing. Dependencies accelerating and attack surfaces are expanding. In this context, digital transformation can only succeed by offering reliable cybersecurity. Next slide, please. With societies becoming more interconnected and interdependent within large-scale virtual networks, the traditional geopolitical struggle to control fixed territories are shifting to influencing virtual networks. Network flows, unlike fixed territorial units, cannot be contained or controlled, only influenced. Thus, a state gains power in networks by building and cultivating dependencies, and first mover advantage becomes vital for influencing. It's then no surprise that 5G technology, with its ability to influence the operation of networks, has attracted not only competition between companies, but also a geopolitical confrontation between superpowers. The 5G leadership also means the ability to set the standards for network infrastructure and define a specification for future innovations, leading to significant economic gain, but also enormous dependencies. Currently, out of 5 key 5G vendors, Huawei and ZTE are from China, but their close ties to the Chinese government raises suspicions about their intentions. US has sparked a debate that Huawei and China will use 5G dominance to fundamentally reshape the internet to promote authoritarian values. China's vision of internet reflects its ideological convictions, as manifested in China's Great Firewall. Its technology leadership could fragment internet architecture and undermine its mutual stakeholder model of governance, shifting innovation from empowering citizens to controlling citizens, with wider consequences for our societies and indeed for the world order. Next slide, please. As we can see in this map, despite security concerns over Huawei's affiliation with the Chinese government, and despite the US pressure and sanctions, Huawei is spreading around the world. The problem is the geopolitical context, which during the Cold War was neat and predictable, is now multipolar, volatile, and complex. Alignments are opportunistic and situational. To make matters more complicated, private sector and international organizations have entered the game as independent players. In this unpredictable context, how the US and Europe interact on 5G is critical, and we have distinguished speakers to help us to navigate this complex context. And on that note, I would like to hand the floor to Greg for an interesting discussion.
Let me say welcome to our distinguished guests. I could spend most of the rest of our time introducing them. I won't do that, but suffice to say, Tom Wheeler has been working on these issues for a very long time, and he was chairman of the Federal Communication Commission from 2013 to 2017. We welcome him.
Tom, again, thanks for joining us. You've just published a major paper on 5G and security. I'm sorry, we may well have been hacked. Oh, my goodness.
You know, Greg, I've had a lot of responses to presentations I've made over my life, but never quite any like these.
Yes, I apologize. Obviously, we've not been good enough at security in a session about 5G and security, so apologies.
This is a classic example that our networks are porous, and that digital security is national security. Ergo, we ought to be worrying about these kinds of problems. 5G brings is that there is a paradox, that it delivers all kinds of interesting and important new capabilities, but also brings with it all kinds of new security threats. We need to understand that in a network environment that has now replaced hardware with software, the term is virtualization, that it virtualizes in software all the functions that used to be done in network hardware, that when you do things in software, the one thing we know, the one thing we've seen right here is that software is hackable. And so we have to have an awareness of that problem, and we need to step up and deal with that. No, I guess it was Pari who talked about ORAN, Open Radio Access Network, in which instead of relying on 3 or 4 companies that monopolize the market and determine what technologies are going to come to market, when they're going to come, what their price is going to be, that you open up the architecture so that multiple players can have a piece, and the networks then can pick and choose from here. You know, when Google goes to buy a new computer to put in its server farm, it can buy to a standard, know that it plugs in and works with everything else. When a wireless network goes to try and do the same thing, they can only buy from pre-5G, they could only buy from the company they had already used that equipment for, because that's all the interface was. Okay, so you now have this second issue, which is a great idea, increases innovation, reduces costs, and also opens the door to more intervention, to more hacking. And so these issues together make it essential that we have an awareness of the security challenge in 5G, and then we get in front of it. You know, Jan Easterly, the head of CISA, just today made a speech in which she was saying, we need to have security by design. And the difficulty is that what I found when I was chairman of the FCC was that security was an afterthought rather than a forethought. Mm-hmm. And we need to change that paradigm and recognize that 5G is the tool, or 5G is the impetus for that change, and move forward. But unfortunately, we aren't doing that right now. We need to establish expectations. And say, this is what a secure design looks like.
Do you think, Tom, that we're too focused on Huawei and China and not enough on the broader security challenges?
Well, they're very legitimate issues, obviously, but they have changed our focus. They have redirected our focus to these companies rather than to the kinds of things I was talking about, which is what are the gut issues inside 5G, and Huawei, for instance, has not exactly been sitting on its hands. Huawei understands that the Western democracies have responded as they have. And so it is increasingly looking at what role can it play to utilize the Open RAN network that I was talking about, to be able to have other pieces of software that end up inside the network. And we need to have a process that says, do you know where your software has been? And do you know if you're using open source? Who's the source of that open source? And how do you have security? And again, I go back to, it's a broken record here. How do you have security as a forethought rather than an afterthought? And traditionally, we have always said, oh, let's just go rush ahead and install it, and then come along later on and say, well, how do we patch? And that's not an answer in this new network.
Interesting. How would you reflect on the state of transatlantic cooperation on these issues, maybe not just 5G, but 5G and beyond?
First, the EU has to do its own work. And frankly, I think that the EU are ahead of us at the US at the governmental level in how are you going to deal with this. So if we are not, we the United States are not engaged ourselves in setting up what the issues are and what the standards ought to be, then it's hard to engage internationally because where you stand depends on where you sit. And so what we were calling for in our paper was that the United States needs to get more involved. So my hats off to the job that the EU has done in focusing on these issues and identifying potential solutions. I wish that now I should hesitate. We're about to come out with a cybersecurity policy statement from the White House. I hope it will address these kinds of things. But I know when I tried to address these things when I was chairman of the FCC in the early days of 5G, it was a very difficult effort.
Does this fall into our more general political polarization gridlock, or are there some specific reasons that are making us slow to respond?
So the United States has, since the demise of Motorola and Lucent, has not had a player in network infrastructure. And there is the belief that O-RAN will be helpful in creating new opportunities for American companies. I think that's probably true. I think that's a worthwhile goal as an American. But the fact of the matter is that 5G is going to succeed only if it's secure. And therefore, the companies that are supplying 5G are only going to succeed if they're secure. Right. And so let's step up and deal with that elephant in the room, rather than just hoping for some kind of an economic lift along the way and then, we'll deal with it later.
Yeah. So the O-RAN is an important piece of the solution, but it's got to be done right, not just waved at and said, this will fix it for us. This will create opportunities for American companies that don't exist. Party, you've been focused a lot on standard setting. How do you think about 5G from a standard setting and internet governance perspective?
In terms of 5G and standard setting, we got to realize that European and American leadership in previous mobile generation meant that standards were set primarily through a bottom-up process and multi-stakeholder organization, such as Global System for Mobile Communication, I think it's GSMA, and third generation partnership projects, it's 3GPP. But in contrast, when it comes to China reflecting its ideological convictions, it favors top-down and multilateral approach. So to assert its vision, it tries to influence existing standard setting structure by submitting written contributions and gaining leadership in these positions, leadership positions in this organization. This is particularly evident in ITU, International Telecommunication Union, which is a multilateral body with a state-driven context. But we also can see it in 3GPP, where leadership position was Chinese and there was influence. Equally concerned is China's standard setting practices in digital corridors, with undisputable primacy of nation state as a regulator of cyberspace. So that influence is concerning in terms of shifting from a multi-stakeholder model to this multilateral and more nation state primacy, especially because private sector really envision the frontiers of innovation. Over to you.
Okay, interesting. I can't resist asking Tom, as you look forward, not just in the 5G world, but what do you imagine as kind of the next steps for both Europe and America? For you, Tom, I guess I'd be interested in whether, given our gridlock, there's any possible movement on things like Section 230 or privacy issues, things that are very much on the agenda, but haven't been the source of much ability to do anything about, at least in Washington.
Oh, my goodness. Now that's a jump from 5G to
Sorry.
Section 230. So let me just say that, first of all, as you know, we had 2 days of oral argument before the Supreme Court last week that related to the content moderation issue. It looks as though the court was very aware of its lack of technical expertise, but nonetheless, you know, there were at least 4 justices who wanted to do something, who agreed to certiorari for the cases, and so something is going to come out of that. But I think that a large component of that will make some tweaks around the edges. But this is really something that Congress needs to worry about, and that leads back to your gridlock issue. I mean, the problem is that content moderation in this country, as expressed in Section 230, has really moved through 3 phases. The first phase was the highly legitimate activity in 1996 of protecting platforms from liability for third-party information that was put on them. But then the nature of that began to change, and second phase was that the companies stepped up and said, hey, this means that I don't have to have any curatorial responsibility on what I do. And I've noticed that the more extreme information I put on my site, the more people who come, and the more people who come, the more advertising dollars I can make. And then phase 3, which is really the phase that we're in now, is how it became a culture war issue, where on one side you have people saying, oh, they're trying to censor us, and on the other side you have saying, oh, you need this diversity of voices. And so how we get to a conclusion, to a situation that creates new statutory expectations and responsibilities is a challenging step from here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Paul Ross, you've been thinking a lot about these issues and have been in this business for a long time. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. First of all, I wanted to thank and commend the commissioner on his leadership during his tenure at the FCC. A lot of good work done during that time, and at least from an industry perspective, much appreciated, or at least from my perspective. But I had a question sort of on 2 fronts. So we've been talking about 5G at sort of a high level, but as the commissioner knows, 5G networks are quite complex. And there's an issue of the edge network, the core network, and also a lot of different players involved outside of the ones that we've mentioned here. So I think, for example, of a company like RFS, right, which is providing some of the cell towers and antennas that we're familiar with. And they're, by the way, a Chinese invested company. So I'm just sort of curious about how to consider security issues within that broader scope of companies that are involved outside of a Huawei or a Nokia, Ericsson, or anyone else. And then the second question is the role of large enterprises. So over the last decade, as far as I can see, large enterprises have gotten much more involved in the wide area network and are effectively running their own networks. So what say do they have, or what stake, or how does national policy and network coordinate with and cooperate with, and what responsibility and role do those large enterprises play in this discussion that we're having?
Gee, those are 2 really simple questions, Paul.
We specialize in toss-ups.
I think that there are a couple things. On your first question, there are N+1 attack vectors that are made possible. We've been talking about software-enabled attack vectors. You just raised physical attack vectors as a way to get into the network. It's a cloud-based service, which creates yet another attack vector. and it's running billions of IoT devices, each of themselves an attack vector. So this is why we can't just sit back and wait for the next catastrophe to happen. We need to be aggressively saying, how do we design for security, knowing all of those vulnerabilities? And how do we make sure that because of the fact that all the networks are interconnected, that one doesn't end up being the weakest link because it doesn't practice good security and becomes the entrance point where everybody can get into all of the other networks that do practice good security. So I think that's step one. Step two, you asked the question about how enterprises get involved. And this is a really good point, and one that is frequently overlooked on the 5G discussion. As you know, Paul, 5G is a technology. It is not a product. Yet every time we turn on the TV, we see the cell phone companies telling us it's a product. No, it's a technology that enables other activities. And one of those activities is the enterprise. I mean, smart cities, smart cars, Internet of Things, smart factories, smart warehouses. They need the kind of high capacity, low latency throughput that 5G enables. And because 5G is in the cloud and the network core has been moved to the cloud, there are others that can provide that network core capability for those enterprises. So this is not just a question of talking to AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile and those folks. This is a question of making sure that anybody who is utilizing this technology of high-speed, low-latency, cloud-based capabilities is following a set of behavioral standards so that they don't become the new weak link entry point that hits everybody else. And that's a challenge, and that's not the way we're used to thinking.
Paul, any quick reaction, or you?
No, I mean, I think the point was quite a good one, which is that we tend to, in common parlance, talk about 5G as if it was some sort of single entity, right? But as you say, Commissioner, it's effectively conceptual. It's an enabler, but I think, and you touched sort of towards the end also in getting to the enterprise aspect of this. I mean, they're also the service providers, right? So an AT&T or Verizon. I mean, China, of course, is dealing with their own flavors of that. But, you know, I think that's sort of, you know, that distinction or that refinement disappears a lot from the public discourse, but it's absolutely critical if you're thinking about security and networks. And so, yeah, I think that's quite an important point to highlight as you were doing, but I think that gets missed a lot. You know, they're the guys who are providing the cables, the undersea cables. That's another kettle of fish, right? And these are all, you know, people who didn't appear on any of the charts that we had at the beginning of this presentation, yes. But nevertheless, they're critical players in the whole, if I can call it, ecosystem. So, you know, and once again, this is something that not only the US is dealing with, but China is also dealing with as well. And the people using the undersea cables, by the way, that's not necessarily restricted to, you know, those are large consortia of players from Asia, from Europe, from the US. And so that is an issue for China as well, frankly, as far as when China, if I put myself in the seat of the ministry in China, MOPT, or some of the others that are involved in setting telecommunications policy, they're definitely concerned about things like that when it comes to security.
One of the things that strikes me as I think about the geopolitics of these issues is, you know, we've tended to think of these of the web and the virtual world as borderless, as sort of placeless, but increasingly place seems to matter. We've had that driven home to us in an ugly way by the war in Ukraine, but even on these matters, maybe Europe is looking too much east to the threat and not enough west to cooperation. But even if we think about things like data centers and where information, personal information gets stored and how, it's striking to me, it seems like something of a paradox that in this virtual world, place seems to matter more and more. I don't know if that, does that spark any interesting thoughts, Tom?
So, Greg, throughout histories, networks have had the effect of de-emphasizing place, right? I mean,
Right.
the place-based concepts of the Treaty of Westphalia began to disappear with the railroad and the telegraph, let alone everything that followed.
Right.
And so we're now living in an environment where everybody has the potential to be interconnected. There are autocratic governments, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, others, who have built their firewalls and say, no, we're not going to be interconnected. And what we liberal democracies need to be thinking about is how do we make sure that we don't fall into a similar kind of a situation where the potential represented of a uniform market delivering to and receiving information from everybody is balkanized by statutes that are or regulations that inhibit that kind of interconnection. I am an optimist on this point, however, in that
Good.
I believe that there are two things that are going on right now. One is that particularly in Europe, both the EU and the UK are going down similar kinds of paths. The name of the game, you don't have to be identical, but you have to be consistent. And I think that the United States is going to find, and the companies in the United States are going to find that those are de facto rules that eventually are going to get enacted in the United States as well. And so I'm optimistic that it's not going to be a smooth road, but it is going to be a road that reaches an end where we at least have compatibility amongst various nations and the rules that govern their internet usage.
Oh, great, great. Puran, last question.
Thank you so much indeed. I'm from New Delhi, but I've spent a couple of months in Taipei working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there. One of the very consistent dialogue floating around in Taiwan is the Chinese could probably lay the siege to the strait and make the life of the people in Taiwan very, very difficult. They could probably, go hungry for a couple of days, and that would be the end of the story. And then they're also saying the Chinese will not really fight any physical war. They could probably try and, disrupt the whole Taiwan by blocking the internet in the town and the cities across Taiwan. So you so well said when you began that digital technology is a national security issue as well. My second question to you would be, how do you really foresee 5G being foolproof on two counts? One, where we have lack of technical expertise, especially in global south and small countries, and absence of durability of partnership between players across Atlantic.
You turn that into a final comment?
Well, that's the question that just raises an excellent question. And all I can say is that we have to start ourselves and have our own strategy for dealing with this. And what we have proposed in the paper that Greg was referring to, that Brookings published, which by the way, I'll do a commercial here, was entitled, you can find it on the Brookings website. It's entitled 5G is Smart. Now let's make it secure. And what we were saying is, Pari was earlier on talking about the standard setting process and how that established how the technology worked. But never in the standard setting process was there enough attention paid to, there was lip service paid to, but there wasn't enough attention paid to this concept of security by design. And so what we have proposed is that we need to have our federal government establish a process that brings the various players together and says, here is the challenge that you're going to address. How do we develop security by design? How do we do it in an agile manner that keeps evolving as the bad guys evolve and as technology evolves? And then how do we enforce it so that everybody follows that? And if we do that, then we've got the ability to say, hey, here's a system that we've set up. Here's a system that's been tested. Here's a system that works, or we know where it doesn't work and can fix it. And here's how we can work together. And so, in answer to Pooran's question, I think that that's where the process has to begin.
Thank you. Very well said. Thank you. Thank you, and Tom. We certainly didn't intend for this session to be an example of the security risks of the web.
We certainly did a good case for it.
Forgive us, and thanks again. Despite that, we had I think
you gave us something to talk about at dinner tonight.
Anyway, many thanks for kicking us off. It was a great conversation, I think, despite the hacking, and many thanks to all, especially to Tom. Thank you.
Thank you.